that incredible private world inside our heads.
Yeah.
The sharp sting of pain, the vibrant burst of a rainbow. It feels so real, so fundamental.
It does.
Yet, how does this subjective experience actually arise from, well, the wetware of our brains? That's the enduring mystery scientists are really tackling.
It is indeed a profound question, yeah. And over the years, many theories have emerged, each offering a different perspective on the neural underpinnings of consciousness. But, often these ideas have been difficult to directly compare.
Right, which is exactly why we're diving deep today into a truly ambitious project. We're going to unpack a major effort to directly test two of the leading theories of consciousness, the Global Neuronal Workspace Theory, or GNWT, and the Integrated Information Theory, known as IIT. Our guide for this deep dive is a really compelling recent publication in the journal Nature.
Yeah, this study really stands out because of its sheer scale and the rigor of its design. It wasn't just, a single experiment in one lab.
No.
Instead, it was a large-scale adversarial collaboration where proponents of both GNWT and IIT, alongside neutral researchers, actually came together to design experiments specifically aimed at distinguishing between their predictions.
Think about that. The leading thinkers from different camps joining forces to say, okay, let's design the ultimate test. This involved, 256 participants?
That's right.
3 different ways of looking at brain activity, fMRI, MEG, and intracranial EEG.
IEG, yeah.
Across multiple research centers. And here's a crucial point, right? They pre-registered everything.
Exactly.
The expected results, the analysis methods, all laid out in advance to ensure the findings are as objective as possible.
Exactly. That pre-registration really helps to minimize any potential biases and how the results are interpreted. So our goal today really is to understand the core ideas behind these two influential theories and then explore what this extensive study revealed about their validity. Consider this your express lane to grasping some of the most advanced research in consciousness science.
Okay, let's unpack the Global Neuronal Workspace Theory first. What's the central idea behind GNWT?
Okay. In essence, GNWT proposes that consciousness arises when information is globally broadcast across a network of interconnected brain regions. You can sort of imagine a central hub in a computer system.
Okay.
When certain information becomes significant, it gets amplified and shared widely, making it accessible to various processing units. And a key brain area in this theory is the prefrontal cortex, the PFC.
Right, the front part of the brain.
Yeah. The idea is that this global sharing often involves a kind of ignition of activity, particularly in the PFC.
So it's almost like a spotlight hitting specific information in this central area, making it available to the rest of the brain's operations. And you mentioned this concept of late amplification.
Yes, exactly. Late amplification suggests that while some processing can happen unconsciously, it's the subsequent stronger activation and this widespread sharing of information, especially involving the prefrontal cortex, the PFC, that brings it into conscious awareness.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, how does the Integrated Information Theory, IIT, offer a different explanation?
Well, IIT takes a very different tack. Rather than focusing on broadcasting, IIT defines consciousness as an intrinsic property of a neural network.
Intrinsic? How so?
It's determined by the network's capacity to influence itself, what they call maximally irreducible integrated information, often represented by the symbol phi.
Phi.
The more interconnected and causally interdependent a system's components are, in a way that, like you said, can't be broken down without losing information, the higher its phi, and therefore the more conscious it is.
So it's about how much a system functions as a unified, indivisible whole in terms of information processing. And where does IIT think this high degree of integrated information is located in the brain?
Right. Based on both theoretical ideas and, our understanding of brain anatomy, IIT suggests that the posterior cerebral cortex, an area encompassing the temporal, parietal, and occipital lobes, so the back part, is the most likely candidate for harboring this high level of integrated information. They often call this region a hot zone for consciousness.
All right, so a fundamental difference emerges right away. GNWT emphasizes the front of the brain, the PFC, as crucial, whereas IIT highlights the back of the brain, the posterior cortex. This seems like a really clear point of divergence for testing.
Precisely. And this study cleverly focused on these very areas where the predictions of the two theories differ most significantly. That allowed for the most informative experiments.
Okay, so let's get into the experiments themselves. The first set aimed to decode the content of conscious experience. What were the researchers trying to figure out here?
Basically, they wanted to see if they could identify what a person was consciously experiencing, like recognizing a face versus an object or seeing the orientation of something,
Uh-huh.
just by examining brain activity in the specific regions predicted by each theory to be, important for consciousness.
And what specific predictions did IIT and GNWT make about these brain regions and decoding content?
Well, IIT's prediction was that because they don't think the prefrontal cortex, the PFC, is necessary for consciousness itself, you should be able to decode conscious content most effectively from the posterior cortex.
Okay.
And furthermore, they hypothesized that adding data from the PFC wouldn't really improve the accuracy of that decoding. Now, it's important to note that this wasn't considered a critical, like a make or break prediction for IIT.
Right. And GNWT.
GNWT, on the other hand, explicitly predicted that the content of consciousness could be decoded from activity in the PFC.
Okay. And there was also this element of task relevance, wasn't there? Like whether the participants were actively paying attention to the images or not.
Yes, that's right. Both theories predicted that the neural signatures related to the content of conscious experience in their respective brain regions should be present whether the person was actively engaged in a task involving those stimuli or not. So the researchers manipulated whether participants had to, say, detect specific types of images, like faces or objects, in different blocks of the experiment.
Okay, so what did the brain imaging data, the IEG, MEG, and fMRI actually reveal?
So across all three methods, they found that it was indeed possible to decode the broad category of the stimulus, face or object, letter or nonsensical symbol, from activity in both the posterior and prefrontal regions. And this held true regardless of whether those categories were important for the task the participant was doing. So this broad finding was consistent with general predictions from both theories.
Interesting that both areas seem to contain information about the category. But what about more specific details, like the angle a face was presented at?
Right. This is where we start to see some separation. The ability to decode the orientation of the face's front, left, or right view was consistently found in the posterior cortex across all the neuroimaging techniques.
Okay.
However, this decoding of orientation was largely absent in the prefrontal cortex, the PFC. So what this kind of suggests is that the feeling of seeing the angle of a face might be more intrinsically tied to processing within the visual areas themselves.
In the back.
In the back, yeah, than to some global broadcasting mechanism for this specific kind of information, at least.
So the back of the brain seemed to hold more detailed visual information corresponding to conscious experience, at least for orientation.
Yeah.
You also mentioned an fMRI searchlight analysis. What did that show?
Right. The fMRI, because it has better spatial detail, let them look at decoding accuracy across the whole brain. And this analysis showed that decoding the stimulus category was more widespread and generally more accurate in posterior brain regions, visual, temporal, parietal cortices. Whereas any category decoding in the PFC was less accurate and kind of limited to smaller areas within the middle and inferior frontal cortex.
Okay, that gives us a picture where the posterior cortex seems, richer in information about the content of visual experience. Let's move on to the second set of experiments, which looked at how long conscious content is maintained in the brain. How did they examine that?
So here, they varied the duration for which the visual stimuli were shown for half a second, 1 second, or 1.5 seconds.
Right.
And then they looked at how the brain activity in the regions of interest, evolved over these different time periods.
And what were the specific predictions from IIT and GNWT about this temporal aspect, the timing?
IIT predicted that if the posterior cortex is indeed the neural substrate of conscious content, then the specific information related to that content, along with the overall activity level there, should be sustained for the entire duration of the conscious experience. It should basically mirror how long the stimulus was present.
Right.
And this was a critical prediction for IIT.
That makes intuitive sense. If you're consciously aware of something for a second, the neural activity representing it should also last about a second in the right brain area.
Yeah.
What did GNWT predict about timing?
GNWT proposed a more event-based pattern. They predicted a brief surge of activity and ignition in the prefrontal cortex, the PFC, around 0.3 to 0.5 seconds after the stimulus appeared. That's when the global workspace gets updated with the new info.
Okay, like a burst.
Yeah, a burst. Following this, the activity might return to baseline, with the information maybe being maintained in a more latent state until another offset ignition occurs, perhaps when the stimulus disappears and a blank screen returns.
Oh. Hmm.
So for GNWT, conscious awareness is seen as kind of continuous between these discrete update points driven by these transient prefrontal activations at the beginning and potentially the end of the stimulus. This brief PFC activity at both onset and offset was a key prediction for GNWT.
So IIT expects sustained activity in the back. GNWT expects short bursts in the front, especially at the start and maybe the end. What did the data show about these time dynamics?
Well, the MEG analysis, looking at different brainwave frequencies like gamma and alpha, didn't really provide strong evidence to support either theory's temporal models in the predicted regions. A bit inconclusive there. However, when they used this cross-temporal representational similarity analysis, RSA, remember, that's a way to see how similar neural patterns are across time points.
Right.
On the intracranial EEG data, they found something quite interesting in the posterior cortex.
Okay, what did this RSA reveal back there?
In the posterior cortex, the RSA showed that the pattern of neural activity representing the category of the stimulus face or object remained similar over time, lasting for the duration the stimulus was presented.
Huh.
This sustained representation of category in the posterior cortex seems to align better with IIT's model.
That's a point in favor of IIT's prediction for how long the brain represents the category, the what of what we're seeing.
Yeah.
What about the prefrontal cortex, the PFC? Did they see those predicted onset and offset activations?
So in the PFC, the RSA showed a transient representation of the stimulus category, but it was only present right at the very beginning of the stimulus presentation.
Just the beginning.
Just the beginning. They didn't find the sustained representation IIT might have anticipated, and crucially, they also didn't find a significant representation at the end of the stimulus presentation.
The offset ignition.
The offset ignition, exactly, which was a key prediction of the GNWT model. And this lack of an offset signal in the PFC held even when they specifically looked at stimuli that were important for the task, where you might expect a stronger signal. They even did several extra analyses trying to find this offset activity, but no luck.
So the predicted offset ignition in the PFC for GNWT just wasn't there. That sounds like a pretty significant challenge for that theory's explanation of how we transition between conscious experiences. What about representing more specific details like identity and orientation over time?
Okay, back in the posterior regions, the IEG data did show sustained information about the specific identity of objects.
Okay.
Which again fits with IIT's idea of sustained representation there. However, for faces, the identity information wasn't sustained.
Inconsistent.
Yeah. And regarding the orientation of faces, they saw a brief representation in the posterior cortex at the start, but it didn't last, which, challenges IIT's prediction of sustained representation for all aspects of conscious content. And interestingly, they didn't find any reliable information about either identity or orientation in the PFC at all.
Wow, none in the PFC for those details.
None. And the MEG data, unfortunately, didn't consistently support either theory's predictions for how long category, identity, or orientation information is maintained.
So a really mixed set of results on the time dynamics. Some support for sustained representation in the back for category and object identity, but challenges for both theories around the PFC, offset ignition, and sustaining other features. Okay, let's move to the third set of experiments. Brain area communication. What were they looking at here?
This part focused on how different brain regions, specifically the posterior cortex and the PFC, synchronize their activity and how connected they seem to be during conscious perception.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the predictions from IIT and GNWT about this synchronization and connectivity.
IIT predicted there should be sustained synchronization within the posterior cortex, reflecting its proposed role as this integrated whole generating conscious experience.
Right, the hot zone working together.
Exactly. GNWT, on the other hand, predicted brief periods of increased connectivity involving the PFC, specifically within that 0.3 to 0.5 second window after the stimulus appears, when the global workspace is thought to be updated.
Okay, sustained sync in the back for IIT. Brief connectivity involving the front for GNWT. What did the different methods show?
Well, the IEEG data showed brief periods of connectivity between brain areas specialized for processing objects and the early visual areas, V1 and V2. Interestingly, this brief connectivity doesn't quite align with IIT's prediction of sustained synchronization within the posterior cortex.
Like, brief isn't sustained.
Exactly. And connectivity between areas specialized for face processing and V1, V2 was even less prominent. Quite scarce, actually.
So, not strong support there for IIT's sustained synchronization idea. What about GNWT's prediction of brief PFC involvement?
Here, the IEG data did show significant connectivity between the PFC and both the face-selective and object-selective areas.
Okay.
This connectivity was seen in the gamma frequency band, often linked to higher-level processing, and crucially, it happened within the time window predicted by GNWT, around zero point 0.3 to zero point 0.5 seconds after stimulus onset.
So that fits.
That seems to provide some support for GNWT's idea of transient communication involving the PFC. The MEG data also showed some brief connectivity, though in lower frequency bands, between face selector regions and both the PFC and V1, V2.
That's interesting, some evidence pointing towards brief connectivity involving the PFC like GNWT proposed. Yeah. What about the other connectivity measures?
They also use something called pairwise phase consistency, PPC, which looks at how consistently the timing of neural oscillations in different brain regions relate to each other. This analysis didn't provide strong support for either theory, and they looked at dynamic functional connectivity, which tracks how connectivity patterns change over time. But again, the results didn't definitively favor one theory over the other. However, the fMRI data, using a method called GPPI, did show increased connectivity between face-selective areas and the PFC specifically during face perception.
Okay, so another somewhat mixed picture for connectivity, but maybe with a bit more leaning towards some brief PFC involvement, kind of aligning with GNWT, but less support for IIT's sustained posterior synchronization. Now we've walked through the main findings. What's the overall assessment? How did these theories fare in this really rigorous comparison?
Well, the researchers adopted what they called a lenient falsificationist approach.
Okay, what does that mean exactly?
It means that if a key pre-registered prediction of a theory was clearly contradicted by the evidence, that carried significant weight in their overall evaluation of the theory.
So it's more about finding where a theory's core ideas don't hold up to the data rather than just looking for confirmation.
Precisely. So for IIT, the most direct challenge seems to be the lack of sustained synchronization within the posterior cortex. That was a critical prediction.
Right.
Additionally, the finding that sustained representation of orientation in the posterior cortex was absent, even though orientation info could be decoded, that presents another challenge. However, IIT did align with the data regarding the sustained representation of stimulus category in the posterior cortex.
Okay, so some wins, some significant challenges for IIT. What about GNWT?
For GNWT, the most substantial challenge, based on their predefined criteria, was the absence of that predicted ignition in the PFC at the offset of the stimulus.
That missing end burst.
Yeah, that missing end burst. Furthermore, the transient nature of the PFC activity they did observe raises questions about how conscious experience is maintained over time, according to GNWT. And also, the lack of representation of object identity in the PFC and the limited representation of orientation there. Well, it brings into question GNWT's claim that the PFC broadcasts all aspects of conscious content.
So it suggests maybe the feeling of consciously experiencing the specific identity of an object might rely more on processing happening outside the PFC.
That seems to be one implication, yes. The idea of the PFC as the sole global broadcaster for all features of conscious experience seems to face some difficulties based on this evidence.
And the researchers really emphasize that using multiple methods gives these findings more weight, right?
Absolutely. They stress that this study, by combining IEG, MEG, and fMRI, provides a much more robust and comprehensive test than previous studies that often relied on just one single method.
And they also talk about how these findings relate to other theories of consciousness, not just these two.
Yes, they do. They point out that some predictions of GNWT, particularly involving the PFC, overlap with what are called higher-order theories of consciousness.
Okay.
And the findings here challenge some of those higher-order theories that suggest the PFC actually provides the content of visual consciousness, rather than maybe just enabling the consciousness of content processed elsewhere.
Ah, a subtle but important distinction.
Very. And similarly, IIT's focus on the posterior cortex resonates with other theories that also emphasize the importance of posterior brain regions for consciousness.
It sounds like this study, while specifically set up to test GNWT and IIT, really has broader implications for how we think about the whole landscape of consciousness in the brain.
Absolutely. And the researchers also make a point of emphasizing their focus was on the content of consciousness, what we are actually experiencing, rather than just say whether someone is conscious or unconscious. They argue this approach provides a more direct, more rigorous way to test the specific positive claims made by these theories.
Makes sense. They also acknowledge certain limitations of their study, though, as good science usually does.
Indeed. For instance, they note their study couldn't fully capture the entire richness and complexity of conscious experience. Fair
Yes.
enough.
Yeah.
And they didn't have access to single neuron recordings in humans, which could offer even finer-grained insights. They also mention ongoing research in animal models, part of a separate adversarial collaboration, which can provide complementary information.
Right. Different pieces of the puzzle. And finally, they raise some important bigger picture questions about how we even approach testing theories in consciousness research. Right?
Yes, they touch on the ongoing challenge of how to weigh different predictions from a theory, how best to integrate evidence from all these diverse analysis methods and neuroimaging types, and the need for more formalized frameworks to sort of quantitatively assess the growing body of data in this really complex field.
Well, this has been a truly fascinating deep dive into a complex, really ambitious piece of research. It's clear the puzzle of consciousness isn't solved yet, not by a long shot. But this adversarial collaboration has definitely provided some incredibly valuable pieces.
It really has. It underscores that scientific progress here often proceeds in a step-by-step, nuanced way. This study doesn't, deliver a definitive knockout blow or victory to either theory.
No clear winner.
No clear winner. But it offers a much clearer, more detailed picture, highlighting both the strengths and weaknesses of GNWT and IIT, and it really sets the stage for future refinements and investigations.
So as we bring this to a close, here's a provocative thought for you, the listener, to consider. Given these findings, what specific aspects of conscious experience do you think future research should prioritize to get a deeper understanding of the neural basis of our inner world? Should the focus maybe shift towards sustained activity in certain brain regions, or the specific roles of the prefrontal versus posterior cortex? Or maybe it's all about the intricate communication pathways between them?
And if you're eager to explore this fascinating research in even greater detail, we definitely encourage you to check out the original Nature article. The researchers have also made their data and analysis code publicly available, which is a fantastic example of open science. You can find information on how to